Okay, guys, I'm just going to show you really quickly how I would tackle these letter positive, negative shapes. So when you're starting off and you want some ideas for type, you can open up Illustrator. I recommend you do all of this in Illustrator, okay? It will make it so much easier for you. But you can come in, you can type your initials in a text box, make them bigger, maybe shrink down your text box so you don't have a lot of stuff happening, and start to duplicate your letter forms around while they're still text, and then come in and play around with selecting different type options. Okay. Try to pick fonts that are fairly simple in style. You can have something that has a little bit of character, but I wouldn't do something like a script font necessarily, because I think you don't get as interesting of positive negative shapes. You can get some really interesting positive negative shapes with simple sides and stuff to your letters. So if you have like the form of the letter is very like fine tuned and geometric, you can really get beautiful shapes. When you start to get something that's a little bit more hand lettered or kooky, you don't get that as much, especially if you have a font like an old English font, for instance. It can get a little bit difficult to work with, or they have some fonts like, let's see if we have some Rosewood. Like Rosewood, sometimes students choose this, but it's almost too kooky and novel to have you focus on the positive negative shapes, okay? So I want you to do stuff that's much more simple. So then you can create a bunch of different text boxes and try around, play around with these. And then from here, you can use these letter forms as your guide as you're sketching. So pick a few that you like and then kind of look at these and reference them as you're doing your sketch. Then when it comes to actually manipulate them to be digital, so let's try to do this guy right here. We'll try to flip-flop two of these. So I need to find a font that I think is going to have the look I'm going for. Let's see. I want a serif probably. Okay, that's somewhat similar. I'm going to duplicate this. And then what you want to do is you want to take your letter forms and turn them into outlines, or switch them from being a font into an actual vector graphic. So you go to Type, Create Outlines, and now these are no longer fonts that you can go back and manipulate, but they are now a graphic that you can edit. So ungroup them, because if you create outlines while they're in a text box, they'll be grouped together. And now this will allow you to individually manipulate them and move them around. So what you can do is, if you have your 8 by 10 inch format, for instance, you can play around by creating boxes and doing them to the ratio of 8 by 10. And then you can play around with the individual letter forms. So I'm going to take this J. I'm going to bring it to the front. Okay. And I'm going to use my free transform tool, click and drag holding shift, and start to play around with placement in the format. So you can adjust the scale of your graphic, okay? You don't have to have the same size. You can play around with how it's positioned. It doesn't all have to be straight, okay? But I want you to think about how you can start to create interesting positive negative space. So if I tuck this guy off enough, now this looks just like a circle. It's not even, you really don't have like the reference of the letter form, but then you kind of do. So you can really play around with overlapping shapes, playing around with the edges. Okay. So if we're going to create that one, I'm going to go ahead and make this black. Then I'll turn both of these white. Actually turn them kind of a gray. Here we go. I'm going to increase my size, send this to the back. So I'm just manipulating the size and rotating and stuff by using my black arrow tool. And as you're placing them, maybe your original format is like a horizontal format, but then you realize that perhaps this actual orientation would look better if it's a vertical. So you have an option to really play around when you're working in your digital format. And Illustrator is really nimble in that you can create things really quickly, mess around, flip letters around, and try different letter forms. So one of the other things that you might see in some of the student work as examples is that when you have an overlap of two different letter forms, some students choose to kind of fill it in almost in reverse wherever that intersection happened. So I'll show you an example. So we have these two different letter forms that are stacked on top of each other, but maybe wherever that overlap is, I want to actually be able to fill it in with a separate color, which is an option that you guys can do. What tool I would use is the Pathfinder tool, which is already open. And the Pathfinder tool is particularly cool because it allows you to merge vectors together or break them apart depending on where they overlap. So if I wanted to merge these two J's together to be one shape, I would select this option here. When you roll over them, they usually will tell you what they do, but for some reason it's being a little bit glitchy. But you'll see, like, just how when you roll over other menu options, it tells you what it is. So this is the Unite tool, and you can see now this whole graphic has become one image. So if I were to fill this in with a color, it would all be one color. If I undo it, they're still overlapped, and then I can do this Pathfinder right here, which will break everything apart into a separate vector. So now each of these pieces where it's overlapped has broken it out into a separate vector. So if we ungroup these, then when we have the overlap, we can come in and play around with switching out. Then when you get down to doing your color options, you can play around with each color or each shape being a different color if you wanted to. Okay. If you're working in Illustrator and you have your 8-inch by 10-inch format, you'll notice that you don't have like the bounding box cropping like you do with InDesign. But if you extend your artwork outside of the boundaries of the artboard, when you export it out, you won't see these graphics that are poking outside. So if I go to InDesign, and you guys have probably experienced this now, if I do, I'm going to save this. So you'll see if I come in, I do Command D or File Place in InDesign. I'm going to navigate to my image, desk documents. When you place it, you won't have the graphics outside of the edges of your Illustrator. So, yeah.
I think if you export it as JPEG, you have to check that you use.
Yes. Yes. It's true. If you export as a JPEG, you have to make sure that you're clipping it to that artboard, and whether or not you're going to use it or not. But the nice thing about InDesign is that if you place an image versus or if you place an Illustrator document directly in here versus like a JPEG, you have the ability to make edits to this and just right-click right on your image, say Edit Original. Then whatever changes you make and you save, they will translate right back to your document. So that's kind of the upside of making the edits in the native file format and placing them into your document. Hi. I don't know. Oh, I was in Liz's office.
Oh.
Sorry.
Sorry.
No, it's totally fine. You guys can review this video too later. I'm just showing some tips and tricks for working with your letter forms in Illustrator. So do you guys have any questions about how you tackle the Illustrator part of this assignment? I think you guys will find it's really fun, and once you start working, you're just gonna like kind of let your mind wander and get into it. I know, sorry guys, I wasn't outside. Sorry, I should have looked for you guys. I wasn't sure if you guys were on extended break or coming back, but I guess sorry. So I was just showing everybody, you guys can watch this video online, but I was just showing you guys how you can take type boxes, okay, play around with selecting different fonts, then creating these into outlines by going Type, Create Outlines. Okay, then you have these individual letter forms that are graphics versus font, and then how you can place and play around with scale and positioning and proportion to create some visual interest and really think about the negative space. Don't be afraid to overlap. And the other tool that I was just showing everybody was the Pathfinder tool, which will help if you have any sort of overlap, and if you wanted to create where you have like an overlap on two shapes, you wanted to create some positive negative space, you can do that. If you select your objects and you go to the Pathfinder panel, which is in the window, the Unite button will unite the shapes as one vector, so you can see how now the path outlines the entire shape. Or if you use the I can't remember the name of it. Usually when I hover over it, it tells you exactly what it is. This will break apart wherever there's an overlap. And so now you have all of these individual vector shapes from where the overlap was. See that? So if you ungroup it, you can come in and manipulate that overlap.
When you do the Pathfinder, that little section becomes its own shape. Is that the difference?
Wherever there's the overlap, it will break every one of those pieces wherever there's an intersection into its own shape. So all of these become their own shapes as well. So you can remove all of them from the... Come on. Okay. But you have to keep in mind that for this assignment, you can't manipulate the shapes. You can't distort them or do any shading or gradient or anything. So you want to make sure that you're keeping the integral basics of that letter form intact. Any questions? No. Okay. So we're going to do critique now. Does that sound good? Okay.